Hello folks. In this video I'm going to build a new PC. This computer will be quite a departure from my normal builds. Since AMD massively upped their game with the Ryzen processors, I really wanted to use one in a build. So when I sold the computer in my bedroom office, I started to plan a Ryzen build. As I started to pick out the components, I decided that I wanted to build something very different from what I normally put together. Typically I lean towards simple, practical builds with plain, discrete cases. The kind of computer that wouldn't draw attention or look too out of place in most types of rooms. I've always thought that gaming cases looked a bit like spaceships, and I normally prefer a more clean, understated look. I've also never done liquid cooling. A good air cooler has always been enough for the builds that I've done, and even though I've considered liquid cooling in the past, I could never bring myself to do it. I always end up going with air cooling for its cheap, simple reliability. But for this build, I decided I was going to get one of the most spaceshipy cases out there and water cool the processor. I originally planned on using an all-in-one cooler, but I decided that if I'm going to do it, I'm going to go with a custom loop and I'm going to use rigid tubing. That was the plan and the parts are finally here. Should be a fun build and I'm excited to get started. Now, rather than talking about every individual component I'm going to use before I get started, I'm just going to basically point out what I'm using as I go with the build. Alright, so for the motherboard, you can see here I did go with the MSI Tomahawk, the B450 chipset. Had all the features I wanted, has a decent reputation for being a decent board. My guess is it's not the best for overclocking real hard, but that's one thing I'm not really going to do different than I usually do. I'm probably not going to overclock. I totally understand why people do it, and I can understand like the fun and the challenge of overclocking, but it's not something that really interests me all that much. And from what I've read, there's not actually a lot of overclocking headroom on the Ryzen R7 2700X, which is the processor I'm going with. Alright, I got the processor in the socket, and I'm going to go ahead and install the stock AMD cooler that is included with the Ryzen processor. And I'm just doing that temporarily so that I can power the system up, make sure it boots, I can get to the BIOS and all the components are detected before I assemble the water cooling loop. Now, I don't normally bother testing things out ahead of time. I mean, I just build it and then try it then, and if there's an issue, then I go from there. But I have issues so rarely that I don't usually like assemble it on the bench and test it before I put it in the case and that kind of thing, because the difficulty of taking everything back out in the rare instance that I have a problem doesn't really offset to me the extra work of assembling and testing every single one before I put it in the case. But in this situation, since I am going to be bending hard lines and assembling a custom loop and filling it, I don't want to do all that until I know that the system works and I'm not going to be having to drain the loop and take everything back apart. And I'm going to go ahead and put the cooler on now. It's pretty small. It doesn't block the installation of any of the components going forward. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that on now. And it does come with pre-applied paste. And that's that. Easy peasy. Now for RAM, I'm going with Corsair Vengeance LED. It's not RGB, just LED RAM. I just picked the color that I wanted, and I'm going with that. I wanted everything to be red anyways, and they sold the LED RAM in red, so I figured no sense getting the RGB and then just having to get in and program it with software to be red anyway. And that's it, all done, just like The Verge told me to do it. No, not really. I actually have 4 sticks. Now I'm done with the RAM. And for the main drive, I went with a Samsung NVMe M.2 drive. And I went with 500 gigabytes, which should be plenty for operating system and programs. All right, looks good. All right, so I got the motherboard mounted up into the case, or I guess you could say frame or chassis. What I went with here is the Cougar Conquer case. I went with the Cougar Conquer because it does have that kind of futuristic, spaceshipy kind of a look. It's really unique, different. Also, it'll just be just a very interesting case to build in. Just so much different than building in a typical case. Plus, it supports the features that I want. It does have a pretty good build quality. It has a lot of options and a lot of different things that you can kind of do unique with it. So I think it'll work out great for what I'm doing. Like I said, I got the motherboard in. I'll get the power supply mounted up and get everything just kind of temporarily. I'm not going to worry about cable management or getting all the individual little bits and pieces in. I just want to get the power supply in, get stuff kind of temporarily set up, get the system powered on, make sure it posts, make sure it's detecting all the hardware, and go from there. For additional storage, in addition to the NVMe drive on the motherboard, I went with this Samsung 860 EVO. It's just another 500 gigabyte drive, so not going to be a ton of storage built into this machine, but that's going to be perfectly fine for what I'm going to use it for. I may do some light gaming on it, and that 500 gig drive will be plenty to hold all the games I'd ever play, my applications, operating system, that kind of thing. And then I'll also probably use this computer for video editing, photo editing, maybe even some audio editing. And I won't have any kind of long-term storage of any of that kind of stuff on this machine. So this drive will be plenty for whatever projects I'm working on. Everything will then get backed up to external drives after I'm done with it. So 500 gigabytes should be plenty. And on this case, there's a couple different options for mounting 2.5-inch drives. There are mounting locations for two of them behind the motherboard, but then you have to take the motherboard off to get to the screws for them if you ever want to change anything out or anything like that. And it also comes with this bracket that you can put right in here, and I kind of like that option better. Kind of ties everything together with that bracket. It does take up some space depending on what you're going to put in here. This bracket kind of limits you a little bit, but I think for the mounting that I have planned for the reservoir for the water cooling system and the rest of the components I have set up, I'm pretty sure it's going to work fine with this bracket in here, so that's the way I'm going to do it. All right, so the system posted fine. I got into the BIOS, all the hardware is showing like it should. So I'm going to do a little bit of cable management that I think probably should be done before I put in the water cooling stuff. And then comes the fun part, the water cooling loop. So you can see the kind of the primary components here. I went with EK stuff, EK water block. I got the water block, pump and reservoir combo, and the radiator, and then fittings and tubing and all that kind of stuff as well. So like I said, I'm going to take care of a little bit of odds and ends as far as cable management, get a few things neatened up, and then we'll go from there. I ran into a slight issue with the case. I was kind of test fitting the radiator, and I found out that it did not quite fit. This is the bracket that mounts up in the front of the case and holds this little board that has the front panel, I/O, and power and reset switches. And this mounts up into the front of the case, something like this, and the radiator comes in right up to it, and it just almost fit, but not quite. It was bumping up against this bracket, so I just went out in the garage and shaved a little bit of that off, and I think it should take care of it. I think it should go together fine now, but I'll get it all put back in and find out for sure, but I'm pretty sure we should be good to go now. All right, I'm getting ready to install the water block. The water block just screws on to just kind of the stock AMD backplate. So you just remove the kind of the stock hold down clamps, and then you just reuse the backplate. Once those screws are out, there's nothing holding the backplate on. I have it taped in place right now so I don't just bump it out. But it's a little bit kind of fiddly to do, so you get the idea. I probably won't get a lot of footage of it, but that's where I'm at now. And just for anyone curious, that is the coverage of the thermal paste from the original applied paste on the stock cooler. A little bit more than it really needed, but it had really good coverage. It seemed like it was really even all the way across. And seemed like it did pretty good. I know there's probably a ton of information out there about it already, but overall I was pretty impressed with the stock cooler. It's got quite a bit of weight to it. Nice big copper plate and, aluminum fins, 4 heat pipes. So not bad at all. Seems like a pretty decent stock cooler. All right, the water block is installed. Pretty simple to install. No issues at all. I did use an IC graphite thermal pad, so we'll see how it does. Hopefully it's good enough because a water cooling loop is a lot harder to pull apart to, exchange it out for paste. But I've put them in several builds now and haven't had any issues so far. So now I'll get the placement of the reservoir figured out and get the holes drilled for that. All right, so I got the reservoir sitting there. That's where I'm going to mount it. The EK includes a sticker with the mounting hole pattern, so I can get those holes drilled. It was kind of crumbled up in the package. It doesn't really want to stick very well, but it'll get the job done. So I'll get those holes drilled so I can get the reservoir mounted. Typically, it wouldn't be the best idea to drill the holes once all the hardware is in place, but I didn't know exactly where to locate it until I had all the hardware in, so I'm going to put some silicone grease in the flutes of the drill bit and spin it real slow so it's not flinging shards everywhere. I think that should be good enough. It should keep all the mess kind of contained, and I'll clean it up really good when I'm done before I stand the case back up so that nothing can fall into any of the components. All right, so I got the reservoir mounted. EK does sell a version of this pump reservoir combo with sleeved wires, but for some reason they don't offer that with the glass reservoir, and I kind of wanted the glass reservoir. So I just put some cheap wire loom on there myself, and that's good enough. At least it makes them black and kind of neatens them up a little bit, so it's not too bad. And that's, that wire loom's just pretty cheap at the hardware. You may also notice I flipped the water block. I was kind of thinking about how I was going to be running the tubing, and I think the in and out needed to be switched. Otherwise, it would have been a little bit more difficult to get my routing correct. But anyway, I flopped that over, and everything should be good. So now I'll get started putting the radiator in. All right, so I got the radiator mounted up at the top. I did go with additional Cougar fans. The Cougar Conquer case comes with 3 of these LED fans, and I did want to go with 5 fans total. I wanted, obviously 3 on the 360 millimeter radiator, and then 2 up in the front because there's room for 2 120 millimeter fans up in the front of this case. And I figured that would allow for some airflow, kind of across all the components, across the motherboard and stuff. And then this will, kind of draw some more air up across the motherboard also. But since the case did come with 3 of those fans, basically I could either buy 5 fans of a different style or just get 2 more like this. I kind of wanted LED fans anyways, and these have LEDs built in. I don't have any experience with these fans, so I don't necessarily know offhand what the performance is like. But just in terms of specs, they're rated pretty darn well. And I don't know if they're on clearance or what, but I was able to find 2 of these for a pretty darn good price. So I just went ahead and ordered 2 more. So I have 2 up in the front and then 3 on the radiator. Oh, and now that the radiator's in, I'll kind of give you an idea of what I had to do to make it fit. You can see the radiator comes right up against this support post here. And then up in the front, you can just, if you see those 2 cables, that's the back of the USB 3.0 for the front. And you can see the radiator comes right up against the bracket for that board. And that was where I was about 1 millimeter or 2 off. And that's why I took that metal bracket out that holds that circuit board and just shaved that down a little bit. And then that gave me enough room to get the radiator in between that post and the bracket in the front. So that's it. All the main water cooling components are in place. So now it's just a matter of getting the fittings set up and start bending some tubing. I don't have the graphics card in there. It's a lot easier to, I figure, work without having that in the way. But none of the tubing is going to go over the card. It's all going to go around it. And I measured out the size that it's going to take. So I know where the card's going to be in relation to everything. So shouldn't be a problem. I'll run the piping everywhere it needs to be. Then I can go ahead and drop the card in place, and it should be good to go. And of course, then just a matter of getting it filled, bled, and then a whole lot of cable management. All right, I'm going to be using one of the top ports on the reservoir as the inlet. So I put a drain valve in the inlet port that's on the bottom. That way it's basically about as close as possible as it can be to the lowest point in the loop. That way, if I have to drain the system for maintenance or for repairs or anything, I have a nice convenient place to drain it here. And even though the valve is closed, I still went ahead and put a plug in the end, and that's just the plug that I took out of the port in the top of the reservoir. So I'll get a few more fittings installed and start bending some tubing. All right, so all the tubing is done. Actually went pretty darn well. I really couldn't hope for it to go better, considering that was my first time and I've never bent this the hardline tubing before. And this one ended up a little bit more complex than it really needed to be. I could have just come straight across with just a little bit of a jog and then into a 90-degree fitting there. But I thought it'd be nice to not only eliminate an extra 90 because these have a swivel and it's just yet another O-ring and another place to leak. Whenever I'm working on anything mechanical to where I'm assembling fuel lines or coolant lines or anything like that, I just kind of have a habit of trying to eliminate fittings wherever I can because every fitting is just another place to leak. So I thought, well, let's see if I can bend it in such a way that I don't need a 90. And I was actually kind of just having fun bending tubing. So I think the next step is to get the loop filled and bled and then let it sit for a while, check for leaks. Just make sure there's no leaks, make sure that's all good to go. And if it is, throw the video card in, do a whole bunch of cable management, neaten up all the cables, get that all squared away. And then I think we'll be just about done, ready to fire it up and give it a test run. All right, I'm ready to start filling the system. I have paper towels set up just in case. And I'm using red fluid, so hopefully if any leaks do happen, they'll show up immediately and be really easy to see, and I'll stop and go from there with trying to fix it. But hopefully no leaks. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fill through the drain plug that I have here. That way I can just open the valve, let some coolant flow in, I can close the valve again, run the pump to circulate it, and then just keep going from there. And I do have one of the ports on the top of the reservoir loosened. That way it can bleed so it can allow coolant to flow in. And I'm just going to go ahead and get started and see how it goes. At some points I may have to tip the system or, kind of move things around to get all the air out of it. But I'm just going to go for it and see how it goes. I do have the power supply jumpered so that I can run just the pump. I have everything else disconnected, so the only thing that'll run is the pump, and should be good. All right, so the system is basically filled up. There's still a little bit of air in there. It's just a bunch of mixed up, really fine little bubbles. So I'll let it sit now to check for leaks, and then also while it sits, hopefully those bubbles will kind of collect together, and then I can kind of bleed some more of that out of there. But so far so good. Nothing leaking yet, and pump's working. Everything is working like it should. So like I said, so far so good. All right, so I'm done with the cable management. Not the greatest cable management in the world. Doesn't look amazing, but it's an awful lot of cables, and there's not really any good place to hide them on this case. So could be better, but could be a lot worse too. So I'm okay with it. All right, computer is done. Just have to put the glass panels on. Now you can see the video card that I went with. I went with an MSI Gaming NVIDIA GTX 1060. Not the most powerful card out there by a long shot. I think it fits this build really well, just with the themes, the lights that are on it. I think it just, basically, I bought it mostly for looks, to be honest, but also just because I think for my uses, I think it'll be perfectly good. I probably will do some gaming on this computer, but not necessarily all the latest and greatest stuff, and it'll just be at 1080p, so the 1060 should be more than enough. And I got a decent deal on this one, so I could have saved a little bit of money and gotten, say like a 570 or a 580, but not all that much money. And I just really didn't like the looks of any of the ones that were available as much as this one. And like I said, I think it'll be plenty for what I'm going to do. And you could probably see other times in the build, but I haven't mentioned the power supply yet. I did go with the EVGA Supernova G3 750 watt. Now 750 watts is more than enough for this build. I actually initially was planning on getting the 650 and still thought that would be more than enough. But because of the sales, the 750 was actually like $10 cheaper than the 650 at the time that I was ordering it. So I got the 750. So that's it. Computer's done. I think the build went pretty well. It was definitely a lot of fun. Bending the rigid tubing for the water cooling loop went a lot better than I expected. Now it's not the most professional looking job or anything, but like I said, I think it went better than I expected, and I'm very pleased with it. Like I said, definitely a lot of fun. So all that's left now is to get the thing powered up, get some shots of all the lights and everything on, and install windows, drivers, that kind of thing, and get it going. Couple more small finishing touches to throw on the case, and this build will be done and ready to go. All right, so there you have it. The build is complete. Everything is up and running and working great. I did do some stress testing with IDA64 and monitored the temperatures. The temperatures are more than acceptable. I would have liked to see a little bit cooler, just considering custom water cooling, 360 radiator with 3 fans. But I think a big part of that is probably due to that Innovation Cooling thermal pad. If I had to guess, I would be getting probably 2 to 5 degrees C temperature less if I was using paste versus the pad. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, just being the fact that a good paste does work a little bit better than the pad just in general. But I think another reason is just that the pad likes a really high contact pressure, just a really high clamping pressure between the block and the CPU. And while I think that this setup with the EK water block on the Ryzen processor, I think it does get a really good mounting pressure, but because the surface area is a lot higher than it is on the Intel, like 1150, 1151 socket size processors, I think that you get a little bit less pressure per square inch, even if the total clamping force is higher. But having said all that, the temperatures did stabilize at about 70 C. It got to a point where it was bouncing around between about 68 and 70 for a good 5 minutes straight without ever going above 70. So again, not bad. 70 degrees C is definitely a decent temperature. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if I saw 65 C max if I used a high quality paste versus the thermal pad. But again, even if that's the case, 70 C is nothing to worry about. So I'm happy with that. Now that temperature was with the pump speed at about 60 to 70%. So I could play with, maybe turning the pump speed up a little bit or down a little bit, see how much difference it makes. And the fans were all running at about 1100 RPM at that point. So I could play with those speeds a little bit, see if it makes any difference in temperatures, but at this point, the noise isn't obnoxious and the temperatures are good, so I may just not worry about it. And as you can see, my extra little touch on top of the case there, it's just a big ventilation fan, and it's just sitting there. But I just thought it looked a little bit funny because, you know, what's a case that looks like a spaceship without a space thruster, right? So it looks a little bit like a jet engine or something. Honestly, I don't know what it is about this case and the proportions and kind of the angularity of it, but it's kind of hard to capture that look properly on the camera. I will say that I'm really happy with the way this case came out. I was going for kind of like an overall red look inside. I was okay with the orange panel on the outside of the case, but for everything inside that lights up, I kind of wanted it to mostly be red. So I was kind of a little bit hesitant of the orange blades on the Cougar fans, but they do have red LEDs, so I thought, well, we'll see how it looks. And honestly, lit up, they just look red, so that looks great. And just overall, you know, the way the tubing went together and all that, I'm really pleased with the way it turned out. But anyway, that's it finished up. Now I just got to start loading it up with some software so I can actually start getting some stuff done with it. But it was definitely a fun build. Certainly not a how-to, but you know, maybe you picked something up along the way with it. Maybe you get some ideas for your own projects. If you have any questions, or if there's anything I didn't go over as well as you would have liked me to, just go ahead and post it up down below. I'll answer if I can. As always, thank you for watching. Take care.